had some major changes. Significant, but the process from family requires a lot more steps, a lot more public notices, just to make sure that if you're making a modification to an existing single-family zoning district, that the general public has every opportunity to be a part of that process. We also made changes to the public notice requirement. Instead of just 500 feet, we increased that to 1,000 because that was one of the requests. We also looked at our use permit definition. Previously, it was if the person got approved by council and they didn't get the building permit, that could be rescinded. We just made sure that our definition was consistent with best practices nowadays. So if you approve something, it now goes with the property. So that's a lot of information. Was there a particular area or question that anybody had about ZPL?
I'm sorry.
I needed some clarification in reference to how let's look at go back a minute. That's to the they had just three area or regional.
That I do know that that bill has been passed and it is in effect right now. So both of those bills, every local government has to comply. So if we did receive any quasi-judicial requests like variances or something like that to the Planning and Zoning Commission, the bill is in effect. So we're just trying to make sure that our ordinance is in compliance with that.
Yeah, but I was actually looking at the bill. I mean, at the House bill, to see if that was a typo.
So the legislature in 2022 made these changes to the bill that became effective in the state of Georgia July 1st, 2023. So they met last year and made.
So that's good. I want an explanation by to the current stock mismatch. Wondering why Fulton County was not exhibited on here. We have a couple of other counties.
So there are a couple things that we're going to tap into this session. One of those was ZPL, and the other are some other recommendations and requests that we've had. But the initial slides were dedicated to the zoning procedures law. So any questions related to the zoning procedures law, or I can go ahead and move into the housing.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm good.
Well, I do have one question. Yes, could you talk about the decision to propose 1,000 feet versus, because I know we had initially talked about up to 1,500 or even 2,000 was under consideration. When your predecessor was here, she had done some research on what other cities had done, and the larger feet was more attractive. So could you just talk about the decision to go to 1,000 versus a higher number? And I appreciate the fact that we have increased, you know, the feet, the square feet, but why not larger?
We can certainly include that if that's the council's decision. I would say it depends on the area and the density patterns. In most instances, if you have 1,000 feet, most of the surrounding residents will be captured in that. In more of our rural area, it becomes more of a challenge, but we can certainly increase that to 15 if you would like.
Well, I just want to understand the rationale. I mean, if 1,000 works, then that's fine.
I would say,
But, yeah, but we just got a lot of complaints over the years about, and maybe it's about the process of being contacted versus, you know, the feet. of houses that are included. But I just want to make sure that, you know, we've captured and addressed that issue.
And I think the average for most cities is around 1,000. What we've also done is increase the size of our public notice signs significantly.
Yeah,
And we are also making sure that any notifications for the public hearings or public meetings now come from city staff. So instead of telling the developer, here are the folks that you need to contact, we do that directly. So anyone who's getting notification is getting notification from the city of Fairburn. You have the sizes of the signs that's nearly double what was previously out there. So it helps get the word out there a lot more efficiently, I believe.
Okay, and then the last thing I would ask then, if we can just look at it to make sure that we have captured the less dense areas of the city, because that's, quite frankly, is going to be our development opportunities. So if we can just make sure that that's captured, then I'm fine.
I think what's also helpful is as a part of a rezoning or use permit in Fairburn, the developer is required to have pre-application meetings, so they are required to reach out to the residents as well and have a meeting with them to tell them about it before it even goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So for the most recent rezoning application, they had 2 meetings, one in person and one on Zoom, and of course, we'll have our public meeting, and then there'll be the public hearing. So that's 4 opportunities to be a part of that process.
I think the fact that the staff is now managing the direct communications to our residents is significant.
Okay.
I don't know that we always were getting the notification process through the developers to be as due diligent as it should have been. So some of those complaints literally may have come because the developer simply didn't contact certain residents. So we've doubled the size of the zone and will now manage the process directly. I think you'll see a noticeable positive outcome from those 2 factors.
I think so. So thank you.
Ms. Davis again.
Yeah, I think in reference to Councilwoman Portis Jones' statement in reference to the 1,000 feet, 500, I don't know, I think I read in there, it would also depend on the number of parcels that may be involved in the process, would depend, and it may expand further than 1,000 feet. So it's like they're having another type of guideline. You know, if it's, say, 6 or 7 parcels, then that may change the feet that's around the radius of getting the information. I think I read that in there somewhere. Okay.
And we use the edges of the parcel to create that buffer, which means you're not going from the center of the parcel. You capture even more by using the edges.
Right, exactly.
But does that create a conflict, though? Does that create a conflict? If number of parcels dictate how far you go out, small number of parcels versus large number of parcels, will that have an impact on whether we've captured all of the neighbors that may be affected by the property?
I would say no, because it's not the number of parcels so much as the buffer around it.
Okay.
So if you hit the edges of each parcel and you buffer it out 1,000, it captures a lot more because of how the GIS technology works. So any property that touches that buffer area is going to be included. So it won't just be 7 parcels. So for instance, for the most recent application, I believe we had over 90 different neighbors that were captured. Some were a pretty good distance from the center line. So we were able to capture a lot more folks just by increasing it and using that buffer radius, as opposed to doing it where you just do adjacent parcels.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, we can continue.
Sure, and next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so we have received a couple of requests. I'll start with outdoor dining and drive-through restaurants. Of course, we've received some significant calls related to our existing corridors and looking at restaurants that are existing. So for instance, right now, the way our regulations are put together, you can't have a drive-through restaurants within a certain distance of another drive-through restaurant. So even if that restaurant closes down, the person that's coming in would have to do a traditional sit-down restaurant in a facility that's already outfitted as a drive-through restaurant. We received some requests and kind of drafted some potential legislation for you guys to consider, to really look at whether or not you're comfortable with allowing a retrofit, which means an existing drive-through restaurant, another restaurant can go in there. It doesn't change the modification in terms of the distance requirement, and any new drive-through restaurants coming to the city that are doing, I just want to build a brand-new establishment, would have to adhere to those regulations that are in place now.
Any questions?
No, so permission to take the space of a former drive-through.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm surprised we don't have that one.
You want to do outdoor dining area, which is
Yeah. Yeah.
Also got a problem with it? Or
May I just ask one question? Relative to, and I don't know if this is the category that goes in, well, I guess I can use company name. So there was there was conversation, I'll say, about a Panera Bread type model coming to the city. Not a exclusive drive-through, but not an exclusive sit-down either. Are we addressing that request? Because that is now, and it was spurred by COVID, a new business model. And I think we would do ourselves a disservice if we don't at least allow for that possibility.
Yeah.
we can definitely
do
Yeah, we
that.
discussed that. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right, now, any other questions for me? Okay, so now the next one is housing. The information that was included in the packet was a summary from the Georgia Planning Association. They had a event a couple of months ago where they talked about housing in Georgia and the need for looking at additional options. One of those, of course, was looking at your number of households versus the number of rooms and the types of housing structures that you have in a city. I thought it was a great presentation because economic development is closely tied to housing.
Yeah.
There is a critical issue happening, not just in Fairburn, but everywhere. And every city is trying to kind of figure out the right recipe to provide for existing residents, but also looking at what are your new architectural design standards, what number in terms of density works best. We have received a request to explore density bonuses from Habitat for Humanity. They asked if we could begin to do research and maybe present something to council regarding owner-occupied additional density bonuses. We can begin that research, but I wanted to bring it to you all to kind of gauge your feeling about that. Are you comfortable with us beginning that process? Is this something that you think would be beneficial to the city of Fairburn?
Can you define that term for me?
Yeah, a little
Sure.
bit more.
Density bonus, you put in your parameters. So in most instances, a lot of density bonuses is related to affordability. So if an agency says our goal, like Habitat, is to increase owner-occupied housing. So they may have 2 parcels, and those parcels would only allow for 2 homes. If you had a density bonus, you could increase that to, say, 2 or 3 homes. So 3 owner-occupied affordable housing is kind of how it would work.
Oh, okay. Do we have something like that in Lightning?
We have neighborhood infill, but nothing that kind of speaks to that language.
I mean, that was a concern. That was, I think, some discussion either I was in or I overheard in reference to Habitat for Humanity. Wanted to do something similar to that, but it was not within our guidelines, you know.
So the zoning districts for that area would limit currently any conversations about density bonus. Typically, if anybody comes to us, we tell you, these are the parameters, this is the minimum lot size requirement, minimum dwelling size. And if someone says, well, I'm doing a project that could increase, a home for a teacher or a police officer. Right now, the answer is it doesn't really fit with our regulations. So we can begin to research. It's not necessarily a yes or no, but is it something you are comfortable beginning that conversation?
I am.
May I ask a question? Yes, I'm interested in that. I've not heard that term before. My question would be, would you have a designated area for a density bonus? Or is it throughout the city? If I have a vacant lot and I'm wanting to work with Habitat for that, would I be allowed under the density bonus?
My recommendation would be to figure out sort of a targeted area where
Okay.
development is challenged and not do it citywide, just so you can kind of gauge from a policy-wise whether or not it's beneficial.
Okay.
The other,
And then-
go ahead, no, you go ahead, you still got the floor.
And how would that differ from just rezoning an area for density?
You wouldn't have to rezone it in that instance. We could still make sure that the public participation process is a part of that, but it wouldn't require a rezoning. So for instance, now in all of the single-family residential, there is some language in there about senior development. And if you want to increase your density for senior development, you would have to do a use permit, which means you have to go before planning and zoning and then come before city council and present your project. So it's already kind of in there, but we're just kind of looking at additional options, kind of focused on opening the parameters and figuring out what other cities are doing and presenting that to you at a later date to figure out kind of which areas, what are you comfortable with in terms of the language. Now, I believe very strongly in high architectural design standards. I think you can do both, have density and also have a product that has a longer life cycle and looks good and fits the character of the community.
Which you answered part of the question I had. And so my question was gonna be, based on the bonus that you're talking about in this case, does this drop us the housing in a certain, am I using the right word?
The value, you
The
mean?
value
Yeah.
to a certain level that would be deemed affordable housing or
So,
or
and I'll
strictly
defer to
into?
Ms. Brookins to get into the specifics here. The answer to your question is no. And I think one of the things that we are endeavoring to do is to think in terms of the current housing market, how we meet the needs of the missing middle of the market.
Right.
We have working families who simply can't afford homes in some of our communities. They're
Correct.
just, and these are gainfully employed folks who go to work every day, pay bills, have families, and simply are priced out of the market. So Mayor, what Ms. Brookins, her last comment was, you don't have to compromise standards to create affordability. There is, on the part of some, this idea that the moment you say affordable housing, you're talking about the projects. We've got to dispel that and help people to understand, one, this council would never approve that. And two, this staff would never recommend that. And so we have to kind of remove that stigma. Because you're talking about bank tellers, grocery store managers, police officers, firemen. We're talking about creating homes for folks like that, not recreating the projects. And I hate to even use that term because it's such a negative.
And in the day, that
connotation.
was a big deal.
Right, and so
Yes.
oftentimes when you talk about that, or even rental properties, people think you're talking about lowering the standard of living in our city. I want to be very clear that though we will look at these creative options, as long as you allow me to be the city administrator, we are never going to bring something to you that is going to lower the standard of living in the city of Fairburn. We think that there's an opportunity to do both. But I'll stop there and let Ms. Brookins kind of talk. She's the expert.
Yes, I've seen this happen in a lot of communities in terms of just looking at creative ways to get an end product that fits very well with your existing neighborhoods.
Right.
I think that requires a lot of conversations with residents, kind of just talking to them about the current housing market. Because a lot of times when you say, hey, you know, look at different types of housing styles, if people look at the number, they're like, yeah, I'm not comfortable with that. But then if you look at the market value for certain homes, if you look at the architectural styles, you can better feel or get a sense of what best fits the city of Fairburn. And we'll bring that research to you so you can kind of dive through it and figure out, this might work perfectly and this not so much.
Well, and just so you know, I mean, as coincidentally, yesterday I was over at Trillage, and I was actually at Thumbs Up, and as I was looking at the housing standard, believe it or not, that it literally sits if you're standing outside of Thumbs Up and looks. Most people never pay attention to the back of it, and that's what, knowing that we was having this conversation, and so basically in this case, that's where you came from, you were part of that. Part of that regime that helped ultimately put that foundation in place. So you basically answered the questions I would have had concerns as a result of what I saw coincidentally yesterday over in Trillage in Fayette County.
I don't think that there is a one-size-fit-all approach. Oftentimes when you see certain development patterns that are really trendy, I'm a little bit cautious with those because you don't know how long they will be sustainable. But when you can have commercial development that creates that mixed use and introduce some density, you create a product that's a little bit more sustainable. But then you also have your specific design standards, and you don't waver from those, so that the end product, even if it switches hands, you get new restaurants, the staying power of that community stays intact.
Yes, great.
I
Go ahead.
I totally agree, and really, we need another term than affordable, but short of that, we need a definition, a common one, right? But housing cost has to do with the amount of acreage that you're on. So a $300,000 house on a quarter of an acre is different than a $300,000 house on an acre or above. And so we need to start including that in the conversation about acreage, and that unfortunately we can't have it both ways. If we want restaurants and shopping, which we hear all the time, people telling us that's what they want, right? Then the developers and the owners of those say, well, no, we can't come to Fairburn because you don't have enough rooftops. You don't have enough density. And we've got to start using that language over and over again and explaining to people about that land has a huge impact on housing affordability. And so I just want, and the last thing I'll say is NOC is embarking on an initiative under the current president called the Housing Accelerator, and they are working with the National Planning Association to come up with some strategies and suggestions for cities all over the country to help deal with this issue. It is not unique to Fairburn. It is our neighbors to the north and to the south and all over the United States. And so when that is done, I think that would provide us with some great feedback. The last thing I want to say is some cities are doing some really bold, novel, and I thought kind of scary things. For instance, the city of Tacoma, they passed an ordinance saying no more R1s.
No more who?
R1.
R1.
Single family. Now that's huge. That is huge. I'm not advocating that we go that route, but my point is that people are being aggressive and assertive and thinking outside the box when it comes to trying to deal with this housing issue. And Fairburn has to be the same. And our challenge, colleagues, is to balance Fairburn's quality of life, because that's what we hear, with Fairburn's desire to be this up-and-coming city, to have these nice restaurants and shopping. And so that's our challenge. And we're looking to staff to help us do that.
So that is, you made a plethora of good points there, Councilmember Portis Jones. But in essence, that is the proverbial sweet spot that we as staff are trying to firmly establish. All of us want to keep the wonderful things that make Fairburn Fairburn. Growth isn't optional. It's going to happen. What is the option is how we manage that growth. We want to manage it to positive outcomes that preserves the wonderful things that people who've lived here for 40 years want to see remain. But we also have to have an open enough approach. You talked about density. Trilith is a wonderful development, but it's not magic. There is a housing development combined with commercial mixed use that makes that sustainable. Those restaurants wouldn't be there
Absolutely,
if there were no homes,
right,
because people can drive home, park, and some of them can walk to a restaurant.
yeah.
And so if I'm a restaurant owner, I'm like, that's a pretty good, I'll locate a restaurant there.
Yeah.
So we have to have an open enough perspective that we understand that those discussions around density mean that we are trying to create a new Fairburn.
Right.
We're just trying to manage the growth that is going to happen anyway, because we've seen examples, some locally, of what happens when you don't manage growth.
Absolutely.
And suddenly you get this runaway density, you get stuff popping up all over the place, and our zoning standards right now were created for a different time and a different market. And so through this process, what Ms. Brookins is going to help us to figure out, along with all of you, of course, is how do we need to make those changes to adapt to the current conditions, to keep Fairburn Fairburn, but also manage positive growth. And that's that sweet spot that we're looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Anything we need to know about chickens at all?
No. So the two red dots are the areas that we're talking about today. Of course, we're looking at a lot of those other areas, but I just wanted to kind of give an update on that, given the recent request, and just get a feel from council on where you were more interested in us continuing that conversation.
Yeah.
And just so council would understand too, as I'm sure by now you figured out, part of what the tactic was, in this case, of the hiring Ms. Brookins, was to bring a person in here that could actually take us to the next level.
Yeah.
That, in so many words, been there, done that. You heard me mention Trilogy. In this case, came from the city of Fayetteville. So a lot of the growth that I commend that government in its entirety, a lot of the growth that you see as a combination of all these different tabs that are actually on the screen that's been addressed. But what we recognize too, you can't get there overnight. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day. And so there's a procedural, legislative procedure we have to go through, hearings and whole nine yards. So again, that's basically our tactic now, is how do we simultaneously get in position to have a conversation about some of the mixed use that we're talking about, that economic development team is talking about right now. So
Yes.
just wanted to just mention that. That's you'll hear more about that very soon. You got any more? Go ahead.
Any questions for me?
I'm sorry, did any of the members of council have any more questions?
We're good.
I'd just like to make one statement.
Yes, ma'am.
So I have a lot to share regarding our meeting, but at our retreat, we talked about municipal bonding, and I attended a session on racial equity and municipal bonding, which was, it really looked at historically how municipal bonding was used and misused, or not thought through relative to the impact that it had on neighborhoods. And that there are, and this is part of the Biden's administration as well, dollars available to help reconnect communities. That's not a factor for us at the moment. But I just wanted to bring that up as we talk about or even consider, going to market for whatever project, that becomes part of the conversation as well. And racial equity and diversity in the broadest sense of the word. So I just wanted to, register that information, and that's something that we should look at and consider as we talk about needing to bond, if that ever occurs. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments by council?
A comment, but
Go ahead, sir.
in this, I guess, to you, Ms. Brookins, as well as the city administrator, have we had some continued discussions and thoughts about Hudson Plaza?
Concerning redevelopment or?
Yes.
So that is one of the sites identified as a catalytic site in our LCI downtown master plan. So there is not a current development project for that site. It is one that we are targeting for redevelopment and looking to see how we move forward with doing that. On one of our other catalytic sites, we've got some conversations going. And so it is a sequence. And so it is definitely a catalytic site, but no, there's not a current plan in place to redevelop it.
Okay. And I believe we had some conversation some time back in reference to empty businesses, buildings, and we were trying to find a way to re-engage, redirect, resurrect. You remember that conversation?
Yes.
Okay, and because one of the largest parcels there in Hudson Plaza has been empty for a long, long time, which is going to take some major rehab in order for anybody to move in there. So, you know, with that being a center focal point, if you will.
So I recall that conversation specifically. Yes, we are aware of that dynamic. I will tell you that that does not only exist in Hudson Plaza. So anything we do, we'd have to take a holistic approach to understand if we're going to start to deal with properties that have been vacant for some extended period of time and may need some strategy as to how we address those. That is an issue that exists in numerous places in our downtown corridors. So we'd probably take a more holistic approach to that. It would include Hudson Plaza most certainly, but we would engage council as to how best and what those strategies look like, because vacant properties in a downtown become a weight that drags down development. And the opposite is true with new developments, which is why when you see new businesses coming in, it breathes life into the downtown corridor, allows us to begin to develop further. And so, yes, I hear your point, and we are definitely focused on how we can motivate positive change.
And Mr. Whitmore, I just wanted to say, Mr. Alderman, I just wanted to say that, again, I'm probably aware of the conversation you're asking about. I wanted to make sure that whatever we do, like as he mentioned in Hudson Plaza, the goal that may be the target market, but it's actually in this case going to directly impact every single one. And that's a conversation that some of the tactics to do that I'm trying to find a right pronoun to use on this, but in this case, it's going to be a tougher decision. It'll be a tough decision for your members of council. I'm not saying tough for us to make the decision, but in this case, you're going to hear feedback from the tactic that we're talking about considering, because in this case, if you're going to do it for one, you got to do it for all. And I mean, it's pretty stringent.
Yeah, understood, Mayor, and you know, that was just one example, but the city administrator already mentioned we have other parcels throughout the city, in particular on Broad Street too, so,
Gotcha.
yeah.
So, Mr. Heath?
Yes, sir. I know that we visited and met with the owner of Hudson Plaza, and he had said he had borrowed all the money that he could borrow off of that complex with all the buildings and everything, and had used it on his other properties across the nation to fix them up. So we asked him about what used to be McEwen's drugstore, that vacant building, about fixing that up, and he said that right at that time, and this has been in the previous administration that we actually talked with him, that it had been no plans whatsoever to do anything to that building at that time. So I don't know if he's like borrowing that money off of that to do, like he said, fix up his other properties, but I don't think he has any intention of coming back and doing anything with Hudson Plaza. And we had actually, I think at that time, expressed a possibility of overtaking the property, condemning the property with that building especially. because of what they were saying at that time, the roof leaks and everything like that, and so it's not habitable. It's going to have a lot of work done to it. So I just thought I'd interject that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other comment?
Was that a recent conversation, Alex?
No, he said the last administration.
Last administration?
And so, if there are no more comments or questions by council, we'll adjourn and start a meeting at 7 o'clock sharp. Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
is she finished?
Did you finish? Okay.
Ben?
Yeah, I
she
was just
said
waiting
she-
for any more questions from me.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you so
Well,
much.
Can you talk about the, are we, why y'all looking at me like this? I thought we had a work session.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I thought,
Could you talk about what our plans are for allowing, the chickens? What did you propose on that?
The chickens,
Yeah, it says farming/chickens.
we had,
on the-
As a chicken question.
Yeah, you had the question. and you didn't,
as with a lot of the sections in our ordinances, the farming/chicken section needs some updates. We have, from our code enforcement division, received some complaints regarding folks having chickens in areas that they're not supposed to have chickens.
yeah.
And then we were also kind of looking at the areas where, you know, we've heard complaints about dogs and things like that. So from a code enforcement perspective, that was one of the areas that is sort of a focus, looking at farming in single-family residential, higher density areas, and making sure that our regulations have a little bit more teeth to them, because there can be instances where if folks have animals that are not permitted there, it can be dangerous to the surrounding area. So that's what we're working on.
okay, and then by the same token, for instance, Atlanta allows, right, in the neighborhoods, allows small farming, chickens. So what's that legislation, how is that allowed? And would we even consider that, or would you even think about proposing that?
I think I would probably look at sort of the pros and cons of it in which areas, so that you can kind of get a larger scope of what that impact, because from code enforcement, we get the complaints. But I understand your point about urban agriculture and how it does fit in some areas. So I think you can, if there's an interest in, producing some legislation that speaks to allowing folks to do kind of community gardens or farming or do something like that in more urban areas, but also balancing that with making sure that people have the animals in areas that are safe, that they don't have any impact in terms of illicit discharge or doing anything to our infrastructure. So it's a balancing act, and we can definitely explore that a little bit more.
Right, thank you.
There,
Mr. Heath and then Mr. Whitmore. Go ahead.
you,
You go ahead.
okay. Yeah, what I was about to say is that I had an example of the chickens in behind my house. It was a Hispanic family, and they were raising fighting cocks, from my understanding. And so some of them had died, and so I paid my neighbor across the street, Louis Dunn, everybody knows him, I think, and he got a bacteria from where the chickens some of the chickens had died, and they buried him in their backyard, and the bacteria got in the soil, and so he was out trimming some trees and stuff like that, and he wound up, I think it's his right foot, he lost two toes, and metal toes from this bacteria, and so the doctor asked him, where have you been? Because this bacteria is very aggressive. And so he told him, well, I've been cutting trees, limbs and stuff like that in my backyard. So, but here again, they got rid of the chickens. Code enforcement went out and got rid of those chickens that had been kept there at least a couple of years. And so, like I say, it is a health hazard from what I've been able to gather from that. I just wanted to interject that.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Whitmore.
Yes, I think my colleague Hattie Portis-Jones kind of opened the door. So this is just a question while we're still in work session, okay? And And my question is, I know that we have had recent history, multiple failures of our phone system and our internet. And I know we identified funds to upgrade those things. Are you prepared tonight to give us any update on that?
So I can tell you in general that there is a redesign of the system that is currently ongoing. It is not finalized yet. It is extensive. And so it is currently underway. And at a juncture in the near future, Dana Smith and Charles Johnson, our IT manager, will be able to provide a more specific update. But it is active and ongoing.
Okay. And do we have a timeline?
Not at this point, because we are replacing extensive servers that have been ordered, and so it will likely depend on when those things arrive. But it is not dormant. It is very active. So there are schematics in place, there are meetings, there are conversations, and so we expect that to unfold very shortly. But at a point in the near future, we'll have those answers as to when the servers will be on site. There's some testing going on as we speak. So it is a very involved and active ongoing project.
Okay. And are we still suffering from supplies due to the pandemic, or are those things
Depending on what
readily
you're
available?
trying to order, that is still a challenge with things taking an inordinate amount of time to upgrade or to get supplies in. We have a IT infrastructure that is outdated, that is very, very old. And so that's what's led to this series of outages. And so this is literally a soup to nuts, A to Z, build it all over again, overhaul of the system. And so it's a little more extensive, and so things have to be ordered, but it's ongoing. And so supply chain does still have a role. It's not as bad as it was 2 years ago, but it's not like it was pre-pandemic.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll start our meeting at 7 o'clock sharp. Thank you.